Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. We are from group 6. The member is Larasati Anggraini, Delis Nur Hikmah Afi, Natania Sahada Kusuma Putri, and then Nurarapa. We are going to present about Sessing speaking. Sessing speaking. Speaking is a productive skill that can be directly and empirically observed. These observations are invariably colored by the accuracy and effectiveness of a test taker's listening skills, which necessarily compromises the reliability and validity of an oral production test. Besides, most of the speaking is the product of the creative constructions of linguistic strings. The speaker makes choices of the lexicon, structure, and lexicon. As a result, the method used for assessing oral communication skill depends on the purpose of the assessment. Basic types of speaking. A. Imitative speaking. At one end of a continuum of types of speaking performance is the ability to simply verbatim imitate a word or phrase or possibly a sentence. B. Intensive speaking. A second type of speaking frequently employed in assessment contexts is the production of short stretches of oral language designed to demonstrate competence in a narrow band of grammatical, phrasal, lexical, or phonological relationship, such as prosodic elements, intonation, stress, rhythm, gesture. C. Responsive speaking. Responsive assessment texts include interaction and test comprehension, but at the somewhat limited level of very short conversation, standard greetings and small talk, simple requests and comments, and the like. Basic types of speaking. The next is D. Interactive speaking. The difference between responsive and interactive speaking is in the length and complexity of the interactions, which sometimes include multiple agents and or multiple participants. E. Extensive speaking. Extensive oral productions text include speeches, oral presentations, and storytelling, during which the opportunity for oral interactions from listeners is either highly limited, perhaps to non-verbal responses, or ruled out altogether. Next slide is micro skills of speaking. The micro skills refer to producing small chunks of language such as phonemes, morphemes, words, collocations, and phrasal units. 1. Produce differences among English phonemes in allophonic variants. 2. Produce chunks of the language of different length. 3. Produce English stressed patterns, words in stressed and unstressed positions that mix structures and intonation contours. 4. Produce reduced forms of words and phrases. 5. Is an adequate number of lexical units, words, to accomplish pragmatic purposes. 6. Produce fluent speech at different rates of delivery. 7. Monitor one's own oral productions and use various strategies, devices, pause, fillers, self-corrections, and backtracking to enhance the clarity of the message. 8. Use grammatical word classes, nouns, verbs, etc. systems, e.g., tense, agreements, pluralizations, word order, patterns, rules, and elliptical forms. 9. Produce speech in natural constituents in appropriate phrases. pause groups, breath groups, and sentence constituents. 10. Express a particular meaning in different grammatical forms. 11. Use cohesive devices in spoken discourse.
Skills of speaking. The macro skills imply the speaker's focus on the larger elements like fluency, discourse, function, style, cohesion, nonverbal communication, and strategic options. And first macro skills of speaking is appropriately accomplish communicative function according to situations, participants, and goals. Second, use appropriate styles and sociolinguistic features in face-to-face conversations. Third, develop and use a battery of speaking strategies and accurately assessing how well your interlocutor is understanding you. And then, convey links and connections between events and communicate. Class 1. Convey facial features, kinesics, body language, and other nonverbal cues along with verbal language. Below is a consideration of the most common technique with brief allusions to related texts. As already noted in the introduction to this chapter, consider 3 important issues as you set out to design text. Number 1. No speaking text is capable of isolating the single skill of oral production. Concurrent involvement of the additional performance of oral comprehension and possibly reading is usually necessary. 2. Eliciting the specific criterion you have designated for a text can be tricky because beyond the word level, spoken language offers a number of productive options to taste takers. Make sure your elicitation from achieves its aims as closely as possible. 3. Because of the above 2 characteristics of oral production assessment, it is important to carefully specify scoring procedures for a response so that ultimately you achieve as high a reliability index as possible. Designing assessment tasks. The first one is imitative speaking. Imitative speaking is ability to simply imitate a word, phrase, or sentence. While this is a purely phonetic level of oral production, a number of prosodic, lexical, and grammatical properties of language may be included in the criterion performance. This is example for taste of imitative speaking. Word repetition taste. Taste takers hear sentence or word and then taste taker repeat the stimulus. And for scoring scale, 2 is for acceptable pronunciation, 1 for comprehensible, partially correct pronunciation, and O for silence or seriously incorrect pronunciation. A variation on such a text prompt taste taker with a brief written stimulus which they are to read aloud. Scoring specification must be clear in order to avoid reliability breakdowns. A common form of scoring simply indicates a 2 or 3 point system for each response. The other test of imitative speaking is phone-based test. An example of a popular test that uses imitative production tasks is phone-test, a widely used, commercially available speaking test in many countries. The PhoneFest test elicits computer-assisted oral productions over a telephone. Test takers read aloud, repeat sentences, say words, and answer questions. With a downloadable test sheet as a reference, test takers are directed to telephone a designated number and listen for directions.
Intensive speaking. The purpose is producing short stretches of oral language. It is designed to demonstrate competence in a narrow band of grammatical, phrasal, lexical, phonological relationships like stress, rhythm, and intonation. Intensive speaking tasks include 1. Reading aloud. 2. Directed response tasks. 3. Sentence or dialogue completion. 4. Translation. The first one is reading aloud. This technique is easily administered by selecting a passage that incorporates test specs and by recording the test taker's output. Intensive reading aloud tasks include reading beyond the sentence level up to a paragraph or two. An earlier form of the test of spoken English incorporated one read aloud passage of about 120 to 130 words with a rating scale for pronunciation and fluency. This is the example of read aloud stimulus. Underhill in 1987 suggests some variation on the task of simply reading a short passage. 1. Reading a scripted dialogue with someone else reading the other part. 2. Reading sentences containing minimal pairs. 3. Reading information from a table or chart. This is the example of directed response tasks. The next one is sentence or dialogue completion tasks. Another technique for targeting intensive aspects of language requires test takers to read dialogue in which one speaker's line have been omitted. Test takers are first given time to read through the dialogue to get its keys and to think about appropriate lines to fill in. Then, as the tape, teacher, or test administrator produces one part orally, the test taker responds. Here is an example. The last part of intensive speaking is translation. Translation is a part of our tradition in language teaching that we tend to discount or disdain, if only because our current pedagogical stance plays down its importance. Translation methods usually creating communicative classroom. But we should remember that in countries where English is not the native or prevailing language, translation is a meaningful communicative device in contexts where the English user is called on to be an interpreter. Responsive speaking. Responsive speaking simply means having a short dialogue. In contrast to the other two categories, responsive speaking requires students to jabber. Responsive speaking tasks include 1. Question and answer. 2. Giving instructions and directions. 3. Paraphrasing. The next one is question and answer. According to Brown in 2004, questions at the responsive level tend to be referential as opposed to intensive display questions. In designing such questions for test takers, it is important to make sure that you know why you are asking the question. The next one is giving instruction and direction. This technique is quite simple. The administrator poses the problem and the test taker responds. According to the Brown in 2004, a 5 of 6 sentence response may be sufficient to be required either from an impromptu question or a minute planning before the instruction. The last part of responsive speaking is paraphrasing. Oral paraphrasing can have written or oral input, with the latter being preferable. However, paraphrasing is a speaking assessment that should be conducted cautiously because the test taker's competence may be mistakenly judged by their short-term memory and listening comprehension instead of their speaking production. Another type of assessment text that can be categorized as responsive text, the test taker to read or hear a limited number of sentences, perhaps 2 to 5, and produce a paraphrase of a sentence. For example,
Interactive. The difference between responsive and interactive speaking is the length and complexity of the interaction, which sometimes includes multiple exchanges and multiple participants. Interaction in the form of either transactional language or interpersonal exchange is tested. Interactive. The difference between responsive and interactive speaking is the length and complexity of the interaction, which sometimes includes multiple exchanges and multiple participants. Interaction in the form of either transactional language or interpersonal exchange is tested.